Welcome to our afternoon panel on Bluebelts as innovative solutions to cloudburst events. I would like to first introduce the panel and myself. I am Sangamithra Iyer, Sangu, and the Chief of Bluebelts and Urban Stormwater Planning at DEP. I'm really excited about our panel today. We have this really wonderful group of people. I'm joined here by Sandeep Mehrotra, Vice President of Hazen and Sawyer, who really helped shape DEP's Bluebelt program from its inception. We also have Johanna Pluymers, who is a water resource engineer with Dewberry, who's helping us shape the future of the Bluebelt program. And I also wanted to acknowledge that Johanna came here first as a Waterfront Alliance scholar at the conference and now is presenting so full circle. We also have José Ramírez-Garofalo, who wears many hats, but is the director of Freshkills Biological Station, Field Station, an ecologist with Rutgers University, and part of the protectors of Pine Oak Woods in Staten Island. I just want to remind everyone that this is a technical track event, and you will be receiving professional development credits for those of you who need them. And we are going to, with this esteemed panel, we're going to run through a couple of basic questions and overviews. You know, we're going to explain what is a Bluebelt. And just out of curiosity, is anyone here unfamiliar with Bluebelts? Okay. And we're going to walk through some of the typologies of our Bluebelt stormwater best management practices and their function, see how the program has evolved over time, and really look at the challenges of how we want to expand this program citywide and the ecological co-benefits of the program. We're going to kick it off first with a little animation, which we hope works. And I'll just try to narrate. So you can watch that, and I'll just read the script for you. In a quiet corner of New York City, constructed wetlands, ponds, and meandering streams provide a drainage corridor that eliminates flooding, removes pollutants, and has restored native habitats. Through this pioneering work, swamplands have been transformed into a functioning stormwater management network, saving millions of dollars and creating a vibrant new recreational area. So what is a Bluebelt? I think of Bluebelts as a sort of this series of these ecological stormwater best management practices that work with nature and not against it. They are integrated into our storm sewer network, and they work with natural features, whether they be ponds, streams, wetlands, to convey, store, and filter water to alleviate flooding and attenuate stormwater. These are a few pictures of some of our sites throughout the city. Springfield Lake is in Queens, Blue Heron in Staten Island, and this New Creek at the bottom is part of our New Creek watershed, and this was the recipient of the Sustainability Design Award from American Society of Civil Engineers last year. I wanted to situate the Bluebelts within DEP's stormwater management toolkit. You know, for stormwater management, we have over 7,500 miles of sewers, storm pipes in the city that are really our first line of defense. And some of those pipes are a combined stormwater and sanitary waste, our combined sewer system, and some of them are separate systems. And depending on where you are in the city, these sewers were designed to handle between like 1.5 and 1.75 inches of rain per hour. Our green infrastructure program started in like 2012-ish era, started to tackle the combined sewer overflow problem, and we were looking at opportunities of where we can have rainwater infiltrate into the groundwater and divert away from our sewer. And we've also developed some cloudburst practices too to detain water and release it back into the system after a high flashy precipitation event. And I think the Bluebelt program is sort of situated between these. There are things that it's working in concert with, but distinct features as well. And as I mentioned before, the Bluebelt is part of our storm sewer network, so we need gray infrastructure to feed into our Bluebelts and come out of our Bluebelts. They are nature-based, and they are really trying to preserve urban drainage corridors. And thinking about how all this works together, if we think about a cloudburst event and define it as something that is a flashy peak event where the capacity of our sewer is exceeded. If you see that dotted gray black line there, that is the sewer capacity. Anything above it is what we call flooding. And if we have our green infrastructure, which you might recognize on the streets as rain gardens, meridian, infrastructure, porous pavement, like that will try to divert the rainwater into the ground before it gets to the sewer. If we leverage our Bluebelt program, we're having inline storage and conveyance of stormwater that gives us relief from our storm sewer network. So, we're sort of, flattening the curve. I think we all became familiar with that terminology during the pandemic, but we're trying to keep it below the capacity of the sewer to shave that peak and delay that peak so we don't have flooding. I think I'm going to talk a little bit about just the origins, and I don't know if folks know why we call it a Bluebelt. Our very first major Bluebelt program was on Richmond Creek in the Richmond Creek watershed in Staten Island, which was adjacent to the Staten Island Greenbelt and adjacent to Freshkills as well. And so we kind of took that name. The Greenbelt was a corridor of protected open spaces. And I want to credit Al Appleton, former DEP commissioner at the time, who sort of leveraged that, understanding of like what a protected corridor is and named it a Bluebelt to have this protected corridor of drainage and water spaces. And, that was the very first one. And you look here, we expanded this program really looking on a watershed level across 19 watersheds in Staten Island. And so it's really, really impressive. And I'm so happy to have Sandeep here to really talk about the history. And Sandeep's going to give a presentation starting out with, like, in the 1990s, when this program was being conceived, what was the problem you were trying to solve? And then some of the examples of how you solved it.
Thank you, Sangu, and also thank you for dating me. So, in the 90s, so that was 30 years ago. And again, part of it, I just want to kind of put it in context that we're going to transport you 30 years ago, in the mid to early 90s, and so at that time, what were we trying to solve? That was the main question, and really, we set out on this program to provide drainage infrastructure to the borough of Staten Island. And there's a little history there that, again, at the turn of the century, there was a frenzy where people moved into Staten Island. They developed ad hoc while the city was still building the street infrastructure in the other four boroughs. Staten Island was kind of the forgotten borough, and the infrastructure never really quite caught up with the pace of development there. And then that was further excavated by in 64 when the Verrazano Bridge was opened up, and that even started a greater influx of people there. So at about the same time, we also had the Clean Water Act. So Staten Island was a lot of spotty development with a lot of existing creeks, wetlands, some of them functioning, some of them not functioning. And I remember that in the early 90s when we started working on this project, it was kind of like a third world. Septic overflows, water quality issues, and a lot of flooding. So our primary aim was, again, to still respect the Clean Water Act with all the wetland protection that was all new. How do you build a drainage system without disturbing or destroying the wetlands? And again, DEP with Commissioner Appleton and one person in particular, Mr. Dana Gum, he had the vision of, why don't we use the existing creeks and the existing wetlands as the conveyance? Because if you looked at the the Potter plan, which was the old drainage plan for Staten Island, all the trunk sewers were right, the low-lying areas were the creeks. So essentially all the big conveyance sewers were in those valleys, just moving it away. But if we built it like that, none of those streams or wetlands would be viable. So our question was, how do we preserve the wetlands and providing the drainage? And again, I'm trying to urge all of you to imagine 30 years ago, wetlands were wetlands still, but there was no sediment erosion control, there was no water, it was a very different outlook, and many people I see in the room worked on some of those initial projects. So our sort of approach was that for the stormwater management, why don't we use these creeks as the major conveyance? Wherever there are built streets, let's build traditional sewers, bring it to these streams and creeks, but prior to discharging into these natural water bodies, let's create a best management practice that minimizes or tries to address some of the urban water quality and water quantity impacts. And again, in the lunchtime seminar, it's kind of like people are still thinking about it, slow down the water, create these water sponges. And so that was kind of our objective back in the mid-90s. And then for the sanitary sewer, we would just build a separate pipe, collect all the sanitary sewage, so we would get the septics out of the system and improve the water quality. So again, going through the stages, once we had a concept, the city of New York had the foresight to at least then start with the acquisitions. If you don't have the land, you can't do everything that you want to do. So we really leveraged whatever the city-owned land was, and then DEP embarked on a giant acquisition process where, in addition to the city-owned land by parks and other agencies, the DEP Bluebelt had its own acquisition to secure most of the drainage corridors of all these stream systems. And to date, I think we are at around 540 acres of acquisition. So again, that was kind of the building block, the first step. And again, a lot of credit needs to go to the city of New York for having that foresight and working with the private property owners in securing all of that. And then here's just a very simple concept of what we, this was again one of the other things that these best management practices, we built them within the community so that there was ownership within the community, and it wasn't just something that we were just bringing the city's water here. So it became recreational. It added to the community aesthetics. It added to the community the property values, and it was generally very well received. And both DEP and New York City DDC, they worked hand in hand in implementing these projects right from the mid-90s. So so once the concept was there, we started coming up with the technical solutions that included the hydraulic modeling, the drainage planning, the BMP site selection, and the environmental impact statement. So again, we went through a very comprehensive environmental review process. We worked hand in hand with the regulatory agencies like DEC and Army Corps. And again, back in the mid-90s, it was kind of a learning experience for them too. You know, no one had done this before that, like where, you know, and yes, there were lessons learned, and the subsequent, it was kind of a growing experience with them. And as part of this program, we also had a few firsts where we negotiated watershed level permits with DEC and with Army Corps, and essentially to expedite the construction, because if some of you remember here in the mid-90s and the early 2000s, there was a lot of capital dollars that were going to Staten Island to build the drainage infrastructure. That was one of the major focus areas of Mayor Bloomberg, so again, so these were the other building blocks where we did the hydraulic modeling, we did the hydrologic modeling, we came up with the drainage plans for each of those 19 watersheds, and that became the footprint of what we were building and what we were doing the environmental reviews for. And again, at that time, the drainage plan criteria was that the sewers, all city sewers are designed to convey up to a 5-year storm, based on what we had available. And in South Richmond, which was the first area that this was developed on a regional basis, the issues there were more water quality related and detention related. It wasn't, you know, and so based on that, the BMPs that we initially designed would detain the 1 to 2 year storm for water quality, detain it for 24 hours. But then later on, as the program matured and we moved into the Mid-Island Bluebelts, you know, we increased the detention because there we were dealing more with a tidal system. So as long as we didn't want it, it always rains at high tide, but we need the storage during high tide. And that's what we looked at. So as I said, the stormwater wetland, again, goals working with DEC and with Army Corps, again, they were focusing on capturing 90% of the storms, mitigating some of the velocity and erosive impacts of urban discharge into the waterways. And as part of this program, you know, which Jose will talk about, there was a significant amount of attention and capital included in doing an environmental restoration. So it's not we just went, built these concrete structures and walked away. I think the whole idea was that we looked at the facilities that we were disturbing and we ecologically enhanced them, and all of the water quality goals and the BMP goals were also to enhance the rest of the system. And if we needed to, on a more spot-by-spot basis, we did go and, you know, if there were certain degraded areas, we went and restored those. There was a big native planting list. We worked with the Department of Parks and the other agencies to come up with a very holistic goal on this, as well as the community. The community was a big, big part of this. So here's a typical design for a best management. Again, this was designs that we first generated in the mid-90s. You know, the wetland science and stormwater wetlands have come a long way, so things have evolved. And one of the luxuries of this project, at least for me as an engineer, was that you design something, you source. I'll be the first to admit, not everything worked the first time. So we had to come back and tweak it. And again, when you're designing with nature, it's not like a finite box that you just design and walk away and it performs exactly the way you modeled it to perform. So there is a lot of trial and error. And one of the benefits was, like, and there were things that we changed, And we've come full circle with it, some of them too. It didn't work, then we changed again, and then we found out that we are doing exactly what we did 30 years ago. And then another of our toolkit was a stilling basin. So where there was not much available land to do a whole stormwater wetland, we at least had, from a sediment and a velocity attenuation perspective. I mean, one of the key things that we followed like a mantra is that we would not allow any free discharging pipes into a natural system, because those were the weakest points and you would get erosion. And once you start the erosion there, it never stayed there. It went through the system. So even though we tried our best to isolate these things, we very quickly found out that it's a system-wide approach, not just a spot approach. We also did streams. There were a couple of streams that we daylighted where, they were buried decades ago, and we brought them back to life. And again, it was all part of the water conveyance piece of it. So as we went through the design, I have a couple of just animations going on, just showing you the different stages of construction. And the construction was also a very hand-in-hand effort and collaboration between two agencies, DEP and DDC, because everyone on the job was in some way learning what was going on. So again, here it's just kind of showing you some of the stages of how these different facilities were constructed and how they went through a transformation, after the first growing season. And again, this facility that it just went through was built in 1998, and it is still functioning. Yes, we have to maintain it, and there have been a couple of times, but I think to our pleasant surprise, it hasn't been that intensive as we usually expected. Then here's another retrofit of an existing detention basin that was built in the 50s. The city took that over and then transformed it into a functioning stormwater wetland. Again, this project was also built in about 1999. And as you can see from these, that ecology and restoration were a big part of it. So I think with that, again, these have been operating since 1997, and here's a picture of a particular intersection before and after the BMP. And again, we started this project out to provide drainage infrastructure to the borough of Staten Island, but we very quickly found out that it had benefits that far exceeded and went far beyond just providing the day-to-day infrastructure. And to our surprise, as these facilities were being built, there were some major storms in the mid and late 90s, like Floyd, Ivan, Tammy, and Irene. And again, this picture is one of these storms that happened. That's what the intersection looked like. And then a particular BMP in the Lemon Creek watershed was built just upstream of this, and that was a dry intersection. So, and some of this back and forth with the community sort of, one of the reasons I feel very lucky working with this talented group of people with DEP and DDC is that their sort of attention to involving the community, making sure that every aspect of being transparent with the community, because I can go on for hours, like some of the stories of some of these community meetings, because people were skeptical and they had to be brought around. I hope that that's the history, and here we are today.
No, I thank you. And that was amazing history, and just a really full appreciation for all of the groundwork and the legwork to set up this program for success. It's quite amazing. And then I think in terms of the evolution of the program for providing basic drainage to like how we're thinking about it in the current context, I think is a good segue in terms of our changing climate and how New York City is changing and how NOAA reclassified it from a coastal temperate zone to a humid subtropical climate and what that means. And I think, you know, in the last few years, we've seen some of what that can look like. In August of 21, we had Hurricane Henri, which dumped 1.9 inches of rainfall in an hour, which is, you know, exceeded the capacity of our sewer system. And it was a record-breaking event. And then just a month later, we had Hurricane Ida, which dumped 3.15 inches of rain an hour. And, you know, we had inland flooding, we had fatalities during Ida. It was a pretty, very intense event. And then in 2023, we had Ophelia run through the city, and its impact varied across the city, doing 2.15 inches an hour, but we did see some places that, you know, got dumped a lot of rain in a very short amount of time. And so we're seeing these places, these events that exceed the intensity of our sewer system, and trying to find, you know, places where we can carve spaces for water. And, you know, I feel like in the last year and a half since I took the helm of this Bluebelt program, I'm kind of returning, as we're thinking about the future of the program, also thinking about New York City's past and invoking some of the work that Eric Sanderson, who's here today, is doing on his Blue Zones research of trying to match historically where there was flooding, where there were wet spaces, where there are wet spaces, flooding areas now, and where we're predicting, our models are predicting flooding, and where those collide, he's calling them Blue Zones. And, you know, I think that matches a lot with what DP is seeing, where our 311 complaints are. It's in these like low-lying areas that intersect a historical water body or wetland. And I'm also invoking, you know, the late and great Toni Morrison, who has this wonderful essay, The Site of Memory, where she talks about all water having perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it came from. And, you know, Morrison reminds us that what we call flooding is water remembering. And so I think in thinking about the future of the Bluebelt program, it's also about remembering and trying to figure out where we can carve these spaces in our very, very built, dense city for water to return. And I wanted to set that up for Johanna on, you know, just thinking about how we think about that, where we think about some of the challenges of taking all the lessons, you know, from this 30-year history and how we can apply it elsewhere.
Yeah, because certainly, as you just heard from Sandeep, so many lessons learned, such great work in Staten Island. And as we have this opportunity with this changing climate to really see that, oh, these could really benefit the other boroughs as well. But knowing that those come with a lot of opportunities and also a lot of challenges that Staten Island had some, maybe didn't have others, and not everything that worked there is going to work in the other boroughs. But I think as far as opportunities go, I mean, just the co-benefits alone that we've seen from the other projects, the ecological, the social, environmental, economic, and kind of making these multi-purpose spaces where we're reducing flooding, increasing resiliency, and giving back to the community. And I think an opportunity in the other boroughs, especially too, will be kind of making this kind of multi-purpose solution systems approach where maybe there's both above and below ground systems that have to work together. Maybe there's some opportunities for putting in sensors in some of these. And then the modeling, of course, as Sandeep touched on, is just super important here. And how can we really make sure we're having a one water approach when we're modeling fluvial, pluvial, storm surge, groundwater perhaps, because we're working in some communities that are just, a foot above groundwater, and how can we do that? So thinking about pumps, other things, really just trying to think outside the box. But as exciting as that all is, it certainly comes with some challenges, as those are things that aren't as cookie cutter as what's been done in the past. And we've heard a lot today about kind of the regulatory hoops, and we've been experiencing that a little bit already with, this is an area that's so intertwined with land use and zoning and all those good things. So how do we make sure we need a pump, we're allowed to do that, and again, going through all the hoops to get there. And I think, as Sangu was saying, we're seeing areas with new flooding, but also we're working in areas that have had flooding for decades, and just looking at how are the regulatory hoops kind of leading to that long-term design process, but also that these are just such complicated topographies. Maybe it's we've got a bathtub effect. How are we going to get that water out? Where is it going to go to next? And then the groundwater. There's just so many moving parts. It's so complex, as we've heard all throughout today, really. But ownership, acquisition, city agency, state agency, federal agency coordination, funding, maintenance. So you could go on and on. But I do think a lot of these fall under both challenges and opportunities, and hopefully we can do some really cool stuff. And I think I'm particularly interested as well as like how we can coordinate with buyout programs in the future and things. But just continuing to really try to do a holistic approach and be as adaptive as we can. But as you saw in the photos, we don't quite have that much space in the other 5 boroughs or other 4 boroughs. So just getting really, innovative and seeing what we can do. But hopeful.
And I think we just have like a snapshot of where we are. We have these 96 BMPs constructed to date. 85 of them are in Staten Island. We do have a handful in Queens, and there's one at the New York Botanical Garden, representing the Bronx. But there is some really good work happening. We're doing some feasibility studies with some of the folks in this room, dealing with a lot of the challenges that Johanna mentioned of these areas of this compound flooding of groundwater and tidal and inland, and it's again a challenge and an opportunity. And I wanted to talk to José a bit in terms of how your work at Freshkills, intersects with the Bluebelt program, and maybe even just like larger in terms of like how we're seeing the ecological benefits of all the work that, say, DEP is doing, Freshkills, sanitation parks, all these investments, like how they've come to be, and how you see the benefits that have come to date.
Sure. So Freshkills is at the confluence of Richmond Creek and essentially allows us to study all of the flora and fauna that move between the Arthur Kill and the Bluebelt. And I often think of the Bluebelt as a connector of Staten Island, whether it's ecologically, socially, whatever. We all kind of, in some way, shape, and form, interact with the Bluebelt. Ecologically, the Bluebelt acts as a dispersal corridor. So for fish, for birds, for mammals, we're seeing a resurgence in aquatic mammals like American beaver, river otters, and that's all thanks to things like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but also to things like the Bluebelt. And so not only is it allowing for dispersal of our animals and the associated ecological processes with the dispersal of those animals, whether it's beavers that are creating secondary growth habitat because they're removing some trees from the coastline, but also for species like our migratory birds that come in and use the Bluebelts as foraging grounds during the breeding season. But I also view the Bluebelt from these other kind of distinct views, right? So I work in the natural resource management space through Freshkills, but also in the more of the conservation space with Protectors of Pine Oak Woods, and in my role as an ecologist at Rutgers University, and in all of those different silos, the ecological benefits of the Bluebelt are kind of like the premier output of the system. And so, one of the big things, especially with outreach, and kind of the idea of the Blue Belt as a dispersal corridor, is the American Eel monitoring program that the New York City DEP runs, with all of these other nonprofit groups and community groups. American eels spawn in the freshwater marshes up in the kind of central Staten Island, and you can see here, I think that's Rob Bauman, my guy Rob Bauman, with a group of school children doing eel monitoring. And so these eels are spawning up in these freshwater wetlands, and they're moving out into the brackish water and the saltwater marshes out on the west shore of Staten Island, and then they're migrating down to the Sargasso Sea in the Caribbean. But they also come back, and we're seeing that with climate change, with land use change, their migration is shifting earlier and earlier to match with optimal temperatures. And so the Blue Belt and the ecology of the Blue Belt allow us to really study these processes at the local scale, but then scale it up to a more globally and regionally significant frame of thought.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I was just out there a few weeks ago and I was texting with Rob to see what our count is. And there's like over 11,000 eels that have migrated this year. And it's really amazing because you think about Richmond Creek, which was one of the most polluted water bodies 30 years ago. A lot of it was fecal because we didn't have sanitary sewers. Mm-hmm. And so just by putting in the Blue Belt and putting in separate sanitary, we really cleaned up this creek. You have all the work that's been done at Freshkills. So Freshkills is the gateway to Richmond Creek. Yeah. And these eels, the adults in the Sargasso Sea, they give birth to these tiny, wiry, glassy babies. And then they're basically orphans, and they have to know when to catch a current that's going to take them up. And they spend almost like a year, up to a year traveling, and they know after a particular full moon or new moon when to get off and leave the ocean and come to Staten Island. And it's supposedly like imprinted in them, like where their parents are. So like when we think about the memory of water, it's also like these, wildlife, they have this memory too imprinted in their bodies, and by restoring the water, like we're restoring that, memory of like where their parents came and left and returned. And I don't know, I'm kind of like in awe of this,
Well, that's a really good point, Sangu, but also we as humans, some of this ecological benefits, and just looking at it from a total Blue Belt perspective, we were initially very happy that the beavers were coming back. But then 2 summers later, we found that they were damming all of the streams and the canoes.
So I almost started saying that, and I was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that.
No, that was a real problem, and that's where, people like, I want to, again, bring DEP staff, Rob Brauman and the maintenance people. I mean, they had to be on the vigil, so we built it, and we just didn't walk away. They were there, and, we discussed, well, we asked for it and we got it, so they're back. So now you have to deal with them, and so now that's an additional maintenance activity. Not to make light of it, but I just wanted to say that like as we go through these are very valuable lessons learned, and yes, of course we welcome the resurgence of wildlife ecology, but sometimes there's.
And I think we're working to have these synergies where we can have infrastructure, but also habitat. And, I think in New Creek, you might have seen our DEP pipeline. We have this family of red foxes that, are super cute, and we're trying to figure out how to protect them while the Army Corps is starting their construction on our Blue Belt projects there. I think there was a montage with this.
We did go through it.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. But I guess before we answer the questions, I think this was a really nice quote that Sandeep had shared from Community Board 3, where they said, "We hope that the innovative design approaches developed by DEP for the Blue Belt system here on Staten Island receive wide publication so that other municipalities can evaluate what has been done here and take advantage of the wonderful ingenuity, and cutting-edge technology. So I wanted to open up to questions with that. Yes.
Thanks so much.
I think there's a microphone here.
I can also project.
Yeah.
I think it's being recorded, so we should, yeah.
Thanks so much for speaking.
Oh,
Check.
yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you. I was just wondering, when you're establishing new bluebelts or rethinking new ones, if you're having to think about climate change and, rising temperatures or other, alterations that, might affect the biodiversity of the plants and the health, like heat stress and such.
Well, I think, again, like, as we said, that this is an evolving program, and we're kind of moving with it. And right in the midst of it, yes, we started having climate change concerns and some of the changes in BMP designs. And I'm sure as Johanna proceeds, we will have to look at that. Like, we are now using Bluebelt type of strategies for cloudburst. Cloudburst is an artifact of climate change. We didn't have the same intensity storms 30 years ago or 40 years ago, or at least that's what the perception is. But our mid-island bluebelts are an example where we do consider climate change and the change in the coastal elevations and the tidal cycle, where we are relying on that and incorporating to the extent we can. But that's what our plan right now is. And the same thing with vegetation. The plant palettes are changing, and we're just looking at what survives and what doesn't survive in those conditions.
Yeah, and I think historically there was a lot of historical work of like looking at what was appropriate and alive in Staten Island 200 years ago. And then there was like a more recent Rutgers study of like what's left and trying to use those two as a framework for what is appropriate. And talking with Rob Brahman, it was like trying to just do a diversity. Like we just planted a whole bunch of things. We're not sure which one was going to work, but that diverse strategy was really successful. And I think going forward with climate change and sea level rise and like these areas where we might have this mix of freshwater and tidal, we're going to have to think about like what is the appropriate ecology and what can survive in both evolving climates. Yes.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Scary.
Hi. Hello. Hey. When you put in some of the Bluebelt, I guess, structures, do they become freshwater wetlands that become protected by DEC? And how do you deal with that if you have to do retrofits, maintenance, reconstructions?
So that was the constant engagement we had with DEC, and as I said, in the mid-90s, even DEC was learning. So we always had discussions that these would become designated wetlands. They would be mapped as part of that, but they also had a separate designation as part of a drainage infrastructure. So there are certain activities such as sediment removal and they're sort of grandfathered in, and as part of the permit conditions in perpetuity, so they know that if there's a particular site that is a created wetland, these activities will be permitted without those, and I think we had the same arrangement with the Army Corps. So it's that. But the tricky issue does become, as we go, is so we create this little wetland, but then we enhance the downstream wetland, and then the downstream wetland starts expanding. Well, that's a good consequence, I hope. But those do become regulated, then you can't do those activities there and stuff like that. But that was the intention.
So even though you might not have needed a permit to build it in the first place, you kind of got one built in?
No, we needed permits to build it.
Even to start, when there was nothing there, it was like a great field.
Because we were always in the, most of our BMPs were initially sited in the adjacent areas there were very few that were sited in existing wetlands. So some of them were, but they were very degraded wetlands. So that's it. But each BMP that we built has a permit.
Yes.
Hi. Could you speak a little bit about the collaboration between city agency and private sector firms over so many years across different administrations that probably had different priorities? How did you keep it going?
Do you want to start and I'll finish?
Okay. Well, initially, definitely, I mean, there were a lot of skeptics. We faced a lot of skepticism. But our first order of business was really to get all of the city sister agencies kind of on board with the program, then move to the regulatory agencies, and then the success of this program is sort of attributed towards like a unified city administration then presenting to the community, and some of the work that was done by sister agencies such as DDC in expediting the implementation of the initial project. So we started this project in '95. In '96, our first construction contract was in. So there was a big push that between the concept and the implementation, it was very fast track. And the success of that first constructed project and people seeing the benefits, you know, that now they had sewers, they could further develop their property. I mean, that was one of the immediate effects. We laid down the sewers, and 6 months later, every house on that block was sent to the ground and then rebuilt as a much bigger, because they were no longer subject to the septic regulations and stuff like that. So that's.
Yeah, and I think we want to sort of continue this sort of like watershed approach as we go to other areas to really, I think we think about other parts of the city on like a neighborhood or, these other boundaries, but really trying to understand what the watershed is, what the sewer shed is, and understand what agencies are doing what, where, and where there are synergies and opportunities. For stormwater management, I know we're working really closely with the Parks Department. A lot of the work on Staten Island, we were leveraging Parks land. And, we have these sort of informal, like ad hoc, biweeklies with Parks just to start planning some of these of like where there could be opportunities to site infrastructure.
Yeah. I was just really excited to hear you guys talking about how these are now like great aquatic connectivity corridors, and that's super exciting to me. I'm a big fan of the Bluebelts, but I have seen kind of like from the ones that are already constructed, kind of mixed in terms of their ability for like fish passage. And so I'm wondering if like there's any plans to kind of retrofit any of the existing structures to allow a little more aquatic connectivity.
Sure, maybe we can talk after if you want to tell me about specific sites. But yeah, I know that, we had a couple of things of some of the typologies we were using to have like these like fish-friendly culverts. And then, having some sort of eel ladder or fish ladder, and having specific areas where we could have breeding pools for amphibians, basking stations for turtles, things like that. But would love to hear, any specific feedback if there's areas where we think we can enhance.
Sangu, to your point, I mean, every culvert that we build, that we see that there's a connectivity with the open waters, and again, I think we work with DDC on those. Those all have a rough bottom. They're not concrete bottoms. So we oversize the culverts and then backfill them with stone just to provide that substrate. And the same thing with Richmond Creek. We have the fish ladder. So where possible and where there was connectivity, we did do this. But there are some parts of the Bluebelt that you can't get rid of the pipe connection. So once you break that connectivity, like Sweet Brook is one example where there's certain portions of Sweet Brook, even though you can't get that migration, and because of the nature of the development, and so but again, I think we definitely be years to where we can retrofit.
Yes.
Another fauna question. So how exactly do you deal with the beavers, the beaver activity?
My understanding is they disappeared, and we don't know how.
That's what they all say.
We dealt with them. If they were building structures in the main conveyance corridors, we relocated those structures in the smaller tributaries and stuff. Just kept them offline. But then, that's the thing. Working with nature is something happens, and then next year it decides not to happen, or so it is kind of. We know that could potentially be an issue, but so if it becomes an issue, we'll address it. But we're not actively going and getting rid of all the beavers, because the other side of the discussion was, well, you asked for it, you invited them, now you want to kick them out? No, we can't.
Yeah.
A lot of them have already dispersed to other like non-Bluebelt sites as well. So like we have beavers up in Inwood Park in Manhattan. They're not really posing any threat to any connectivity of waterways or anything like that. So they'll naturally disperse. If you kind of keep removing their dams, they do move. So.
Yes.
We have to.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I think we.
Maybe this last question?
Last question, yeah.
Hi. You guys said that you have to get permits for each of your BMPs. I was just wondering what type of monitoring requirements and the parameters that are surrounded by those permits.
Sure, yeah, and I think a lot of the work was like we had a watershed level permit, so we didn't have to get it BMP by BMP, but we got it for the whole watershed, which is really great. We do have like vegetative monitoring, like 3 years after construction, post-construction monitoring for the health of it. And I don't know if there's other aspects, but this is something I'm also just looking to expand beyond the regulatory requirements. And I just onboarded an ecologist of just like how we can better document, the ecological success and challenges, and how the Bluebelts are functioning in that way.
Yeah, the only thing, we have to comply with all of the requirements. The agencies are not giving us a special status or saying, oh, you don't have to do this. So, but what the encouraging part was that they worked with us to come up with a program, establish it. And now once it's established, all of the requirements that all of us face are, it's not like, oh, Bluebelts are exempt from this. So. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, we've done.
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, this panel.